Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Continuum stage, your host, journalist, producer, and TV personality, Dana Blair.
All right. I know we're all friends and family at this point. We're 2 days in. Who has the flipper that's messing with my wireless mics? Whoever laughs first, they say is usually, oh, I see your facial expression. Not you. It's the gentleman behind you. Is it you? Is it you? It's okay. Whoever it is, I'm going to meet you by the snacks later on, and we're going to have a discussion. Thank y'all so much for enjoying day number 2 and for coming back here at the Continuum stage. As natural disasters grow in frequency and impact, the role of broadband in disaster response has never been more critical. From restoring connectivity after wildfires to facilitating evacuations during hurricanes, broadband is a lifeline. Ladies and gentlemen, premiering now to help set us up for our next conversation, right here on the Continuum stage, the next series of NCTA docufilms. Please put your hands together for After the Storm.
As we come on the air right now, Category 4 hurricane.
Hurricane Helene barrels towards Florida's Gulf Coast.
An out-of-control wildfire ripping through homes.
A massive winter storm.
Multiple tornadoes touching down.
Crews are getting ready for the worst of the storm.
Many spent the day preparing.
This is an actual public safety emergency.
The word is catastrophic. This is the biggest storm we've seen.
When disaster strikes, lives are disrupted, and so are the connections we depend on. And when it's time to repair the damage, America's broadband providers rise to meet the moment. When Hurricane Helene struck Asheville, North Carolina, it left entire neighborhoods dark and disconnected.
I remember hearing the explosions of the transformers as the trees started to come down. It was like a war zone.
It's a nightmare. It was. I've never seen anything like it in my life.
But this wasn't an isolated case. It's a recurring pattern observed in disasters across multiple regions.
Throughout history, we've had fires, but nothing to this capacity.
Major devastation over here.
Whether it's a hurricane in the southeast or wildfires out west, each disaster challenges the systems we rely on and the coordination required to restore them.
First loss of service was it was devastating. You go to check on somebody and their house is gone, but you couldn't communicate with them to find out if they made it out all right. You didn't know if you should be looking for them in the down house or along the side of the road. It was kind of scary.
From clearing roads to replacing utility poles, progress depends on working in sync across utilities, agencies, and teams. Because when we move together, we move faster.
We have all crews on deck. We got 13 maintenance crews, construction involved, service partners, everybody we have, we're going to be throwing at this.
All hands on deck.
Crews must rapidly assess the situation, coordinating with others on the ground to develop a clear-cut plan for restoring services. In the same way generators deliver power in an outage, cable providers set up emergency Wi-Fi access points to quickly restore connectivity. Meanwhile, crews get to work repairing damaged lines.
I know a lot of people rely on internet and Wi-Fi.
Our main goal was to get all the vital areas back online. We had multiple people working around the clock.
We had to collaborate a lot with Department of Transportation, other utilities, and so forth to really begin rebuilding the community and the whole infrastructure.
For most customers, when power is restored, our services will be restored, so that's why it takes such great coordination between us.
Severe weather complicates every repair. Roads must be cleared and areas made secure, so power companies and cable crews can work intently to restore service. And a single misstep can compromise their progress.
It's a lot of hazards. As you can see behind me, there's a whole bunch of down lines. We've got to validate if they're energized or not. So safety is the biggest priority.
It's extremely time consuming between having to figure out exactly what's wrong, what needs to be repaired, if we have to run, new strand wire, or if we can run new fiber. If there's already storage out there, we can pull out. And then even just access, can we get trucks in there?
We have currently 2,000 boots on the ground right now for the entire state, helping restoration to our customers.
The frustration with the running temps where it was just that, it was temporary. Sometimes we'd get cut by another utility, tree crews. That's happened to us several times. Our terrain changes so much in 15 to 20 miles, and elevation changes, road changes, weather changes. Some of the areas that are hardest hit are in the mountains and in the middle of nowhere.
When it gets cold and it gets dark, it really gets hard. We are still out here working. We're like the mailman. We work on all weathers, rain, sleet, or snow, so.
One of the biggest challenges was just working through the storm, also having to work through taking care of our families and stuff. Because we were affected by it just as much as all our customers. We've had at least 3 or 4 employees that lost everything.
Oh, it definitely hits home. Definitely hits home. We had one of our coworkers over here lived up here. He lost everything.
Our technicians are so committed to their work and their communities. They suffered great loss themselves and lost their own homes, and they were still there. Day one, working countless hours, days in a row, no time off to restore this community.
With the stakes so high and the challenge so daunting, the most effective route to recovery is together.
What gives me hope is watching everybody come together. Utility companies working together, fire departments working together, cities working together, and all we want to do is help the affected people. That gives me a ton of hope.
It was difficult and devastating, but the one thing too that happened here is that we all bonded too, because we all worked long hours together. When someone needed something, we helped them out too. Not only were we helping our community, but we were also helping our coworkers.
I was super impressed with the cable workers. There was a lot of work going on removing trees and repairing electrical. So I know there was a lot of coordination and prioritization happening to make sure we got that connectivity back as soon as possible.
This isn't just about poles and cables. It's about people and the collective effort it takes to restore power, internet, and connection when every minute counts. Working in tandem, power companies must first restore service so broadband providers can get customers reconnected to essential high-speed internet. Because the faster we reconnect, the faster a community can begin to heal.
I mean, they're coming up on stuff that looks like a rat's nest, and they're pulling it out of the river, trying to get it going, and I was pretty amazed by how quickly we got the phones back. And then when the internet came back on, that was really reassuring. Being able to contact somebody and have that familiar voice of your mom, your dad, or your team, or your pastor, or anybody like that, so that was a big sigh of relief.
Right now, we're at Fire Station 69 in downtown Palisades. This is one of the areas where fires just swept through the whole area, and we were able to restore services at the fire station.
The smiles on their faces make it all worthwhile. It's why we do what we do.
People coming together, that was the greatest takeaway from such chaos. We're committed to getting everything back. We're not going anywhere. This is our home.
Communities are on the path to recovery, but the journey is far from over. As the rebuilding continues, broadband providers will be there every step of the way. With disasters becoming more consequential, we must remain vigilant and united. By working as one, power companies, broadband providers, and government agencies, we not only restore service faster, but also build the strength to tackle whatever comes next.
I have to say, as a Louisiana girl, a lot of this is extremely familiar to me, and so I'm very thankful for all of the work that our next panel is doing. Please welcome Justin Cain, Chief Operations and Emergency Management Division, Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the FCC. Yes, Ram. Mike Matson, SVP of Field Operations for Spectrum. Wally Malia, Senior Director, Preparedness and Recovery Policy at the Edison Electric Institute. And our moderator, NCTA's SVP of Strategic Communications, Brian Dietz.
All right, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for everyone in the crowd for joining us today as well. Any initial comments about the film you just saw before we get into the discussion?
I think he captured it really well. You know, and talking to the people on the ground in each of those events, what you captured is actually what they lived through. You know, what the restoration experience looked like. So it's a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say from my perspective from the electric sector, we try to communicate the exact same thing, that, you know, there's a process we have to go through to restore, to do it safely and effectively, and the idea of collaborating within a sector and across sectors is really critical.
Great.
Yeah, and I think that visceral experience of knowing that all those first responders, as well as the communications engineers trying to get things back up and running, they too are victims of the disasters. And we try to be cognizant of that when the FCC rolls in to assess kind of the status of infrastructure and service, is to make sure that, you know, we're not stepping on toes, understanding that those folks have to take care of their families first.
Excellent. So we don't want to focus totally on Asheville, but since that was featured as part of the film, we thought we'd ask Mike first for maybe a little bit of an update, lessons learned, anything that you want to share about Asheville.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, we have the recovery leadership from Asheville is sitting here. So if you want to talk to them later, maybe put your hands up, guys. You can grab them on the side. But what I would say is this, right? If you think about leading up to that area and that part of the storm, I think most people thought it would be a significant rain event. And it turned into one of the worst natural disasters we've ever seen. And so it sets the bar for how we need to prepare for these events, right? And the coordination that needs to happen, what you were just talking about, Wally, prior to these events, and coordinating and communicating and preparing for when things like this happen, right? So power companies, government agencies, and the good news is this, right? Today, in that area, literally today, government agencies pulled together the comms providers, the power companies, and they're talking about preparing for events like this, in South Carolina today, so I think everybody's getting it, So
It's great to hear.
Yeah.
Justin, can you talk a little bit about your role at the FCC and the FCC's role in ensuring that communication network are restored quickly after these kinds of storms?
Yeah, you bet. So to kind of have a clear understanding of what the operations and emergency management does, we have certain pillars that we have to meet during major disasters. First and foremost, we need to raise awareness of what the impacts of those disasters are. And we do that from kind of that bottom-up approach. First things first, when we begin coordinating, and that's that second pillar that I was going to get into, when we begin coordinating with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and with state and local officials, in this case it was Greg Hauser in North Carolina, who's a statewide interoperability coordinator and the ESF2 lead, we want to make sure that they have the information they need to be able to prioritize the resources effectively. So we activate our disaster information reporting system. We had already had it activated through the course of Helene in multiple states, and we just kept having to add counties to the activation because we didn't anticipate the storm moving in the way it did. And again, that severity, we didn't really anticipate what was originally thought going to be that rain event, right? So not only were we looking at rain and wind, but then we were also faced with the challenges of mudslides. So first raising awareness of those communication services and that infrastructure to figure out where the greatest impacts of the disaster had taken place, to help that prioritization, coordination with our federal and state officials, and then again, getting teams on the ground to be able to assess a lot of the data that we're getting from the carriers to validate that, but also to identify some of those niche areas where the major providers may not have some insights, where it may be a smaller communications provider who is struggling to get access to the disaster information reporting system, which is an online tool to be able to publish that information. So we're trying to make those connections at the national level and at the team level. So when we deploy, we're deploying personnel down to the Regional Response Coordination Center, which is led by FEMA, or down to the state EOCs or the joint operations facilities as well.
And how long have you been doing this?
I've been doing this since 2016.
Wally, maybe you can talk a little bit about what the Edison Electric Institute is doing, your role, and how you're working to step up coordination between all of these different stakeholders.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. So EEI is the trade association for the investor-owned electric companies in the United States. Our members serve about 70% of the ultimate electricity customers. In my role at the organization, I largely support our mutual assistance and emergency response activities. You know, full disclosure, I'm not a lineman, I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm not climbing a pole. When people say, what do you do during a disaster? I mostly talk on the phone, so I rely on communications quite a bit. But one of the things we do is we facilitate bringing our members together so they can support those regions that are impacted through mutual aid or mutual assistance. And then also I play a role trying to help coordinate our activities across sectors, in particular with the communications sector. Since 2018 or so, we've had a variety of concerted efforts on the response side to help foster that collaboration, because we can't do our jobs without communications, just like communications companies have a hard time operating without power.
Definitely. Mike, maybe you can talk a little bit, besides restoring your customers' networks and access, what else does broadband providers like Spectrum do to assist first responders and public safety in these areas when these disasters strike?
You know, I think the first thing we do is prepare well, right? And so if you think about that, you know, we have a disaster response protocols as a company. We don't wait for a storm to drill those. You know, there's, you know, constant, you know, practice happens. Everybody knows their role and responsibility in a storm, right? And it's all hands on deck. When it happens, you know, we're constantly monitoring the weather. We have a couple events in the Atlantic happening right now, and we've been tuned in. And should something happen, we're ready to respond, right? You know, just when an event is imminent, right, just lining up resources, making sure we have contract restoration crews. We have no problem with travel resources inside. Our workforce is dedicated to these things, so we'll stage that. Moving materials, identifying a stage and location, you know, securing hotels for everybody. You know, all of that takes place, moving trailers full of generators into the area, having fuel pods just in case we can't get fuel. So all of that happens in preparation for a storm, so we can respond efficiently. And then communication, first with our workforce, you know, and we talk about safety in these events. And then we go out and check all their PPE, make sure everything is working in order, and they have everything they need to operate safely. You know, we communicate with local government, right? Government agencies. We try to connect with power companies to coordinate a response. We certainly assign people to EOCs to help, you know, support communication and efficient response. And then to our customers, right? As the events unfold, our comms decks proactively communicate, you know, the status of our service to our customers, restoration times, et cetera. So all of that helps us be prepared to support, you know, the first responders. If we're not there and we're not prepared, it's impossible to support first responders, right? And then, you know, in Asheville, for instance, you know, we jumped through hoops to make sure we were able to provide service to fire departments, to police, to EOCs, to hospitals, you know, anywhere the community needed us. That was prioritized. We wanted to be able to support the people who were driving the restoration and supporting the community through it. So we always do that. You know, you'll see over there we have one of our Wi-Fi trailers that we deploy. That's something we started doing this year and in a couple of locations. So for instance, Kerrville, Texas, after the flooding, you know, the staging area for the first responders, there was no communications there. You know, us, other providers, we brought out our mobile trailers. You know, interesting conversation about the 6 gigahertz band this week happening. I think it's more than this week, but it's been a topic here for sure. Well, that's what we use, to provide low latency, high capacity Wi-Fi in those areas. We need that 6 gigahertz band, right? We deploy CBS radios for 5G service, strand mounted, so our mobile customers can access that. We also open up our Wi-Fi network to the general public, not just our customers, to the general public. And, we have that deployed all over our footprint. So that's some of what we do to try to support first responders, but also the public in general.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Justin, can you talk about the role of the FCC and how you interact with the other federal agencies and who does what and how you know when to deploy resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this whole construct, and many of you are probably already familiar with this, the National Response Framework. And under the National Response Framework of the NRF are multiple annexes, emergency support function annexes. We fall under emergency support function 2. We are a supporting entity, with FEMA being the lead federal agency and then CISA being that co-lead. What we typically do is we outline kind of the regulatory authorities that we have and make those available during disasters to be able to enable the use of spectrum where it may not otherwise be available. We'll go ahead and issue special temporary authorities for the use of new equipment and technologies. But ultimately, CISA and FEMA come to us as the subject matter experts in communication spectrum, so to speak. And we have a lot of data that we're sitting on with regards to our licensing databases and which carriers are providing services where. And we're able to provide kind of some fidelity on where some of the greater impacts may be occurring. And that's really what we do. We help to provide that awareness up the chain, and not just to FEMA and CISA, but all the way up to the White House. I mean, we're constantly being pinged for additional information on communications. And this also stands for gubernatorial offices, where they're constantly pinging their SWICs and their ESF2 coordinators to identify where the greatest communications impacts have taken place. And I gotta tip my hat, obviously. You spoke a lot about kind of the services that the communications providers make available during disasters. For you communications providers, you all are heroes. No matter what happens, whenever a disaster strikes, you all are at the forefront, the front line, so to speak, and you all commit your resources and personnel to ensuring that availability. I do want to shamelessly plug the Mandatory Disaster Response Initiative. That's kind of the successor to the voluntary cooperative framework that was created by industry a long time ago that enabled roaming during disasters, where you may have multiple service providers in an area where one may be suffering damage to their network such that consumers are not able to actually get into the network, but the other carriers will go ahead and make their networks available so that all consumers, all those impacted by the disaster, can go ahead and communicate with 911. They can communicate with family members just to get some situational awareness through the news. So I really appreciate the work that the carriers do, and again, taking into consideration that they too are also victims during disasters. We want to be respectful of that and make sure that they have the resources that they need, so we can also serve as an upward coordinating body where the carriers may need something like access. We can help kind of broker that coordination with FEMA or at the state level to be able to give them access to the facilities that they need to restore to ensure 100% availability during disasters.
Great, thank you. So Wally, power is often, or is the first system that needs to be restored. So how does your industry and your member companies prioritize that?
Yeah, so electric companies will do a lot of work, as Mike described, during blue sky days, right? Trying to identify the critical paths to restore service. Some of it is dictated by things like the laws of physics, so you have to do that first. In general, you want to restore generation, then transmission, the big wires, critical services, which would be fire, police, communications nodes, down to the distribution level and ultimately to the very last mile. But in order to do that, and one of the things we really encourage both sectors to do is, trade those business cards on a nice day, not a bad day, so that companies can identify what's really important. I mean, I understand everybody's networks are dynamic. So, if you met with your local electric company 5 years ago and said, this spot here is really important, that might be different today. So electric companies will prioritize critical facilities. Some are obvious. Trauma center, okay, that's important. Should have backup generation, but going through that list is really essential on the front end. So And a number of utilities will do things in their outage management system if they can identify that by working with communications companies as their customers. But keep in mind, we're y'all's customers too, so we can't do our jobs without comms. So getting some of those prioritizations where possible in advance, and then the key is being flexible when boom happens, because you can have a plan, but it may not be that good when the actual incident occurs. And that's where the coordination at a local level, at a local EOC or state EOC, because ultimately, when the event happens, it's often the public sector, governors, mayors, county commissioners, the local authorities will help then redefine those priorities, again, within some of the constraints of networks. But, it might be this hospital is going to be more important than that hospital because the roads wash out and nobody can get there. So having a seat at that table where those public sector decisions are made is really vital to then, so that companies can follow us to make those restorations go through.
Absolutely. So this question could be for everyone or anyone is, can you talk about the challenges between the different types of natural disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, blizzards, other kinds of events? Do they present different challenges, or they're all tackled pretty much the same protocols and it's just adapting to the different area?
So, the type of event, we're good at all of them, right? We prepare for all of them. And I think the real challenge is just the coordination that we talk about up front, right? Getting government agencies, power companies, and comms, communications companies together and coordinating a response. When it goes well, it goes well. And we have some great examples of that, right? During Milton, we participated in the EOC. The power company participated, they repaired, and we were right behind them repairing, right? And, Temple, Texas, we had a pretty devastating tornado there. And it was a proud moment for us all. We had our in-house aerial crews right behind, 2 poles behind. Jimmy led that effort, right? 2 poles behind him, stringing up our service. In the wildfires in California, everybody participating in the EOC. We knew where we could not access because there were fires, and we knew where we could go, right, and restore. In Asheville it took us a little bit to get our legs there, but where we had communities of 5,000 customers that we needed to get fiber to, it was walk down the hall and get approval and not have to go through the whole permitting process. They'd send an email approving the permits to go do that. So when it's great, it's great. I don't know that it happens enough or there's enough of a coordinated effort. And, I think if we take anything away, especially from, the events in Asheville, right, with Hurricane Helene, it's we need to be in front of it. We need to talk now, not then. And we have to have a response prepared, together. Coordinating together, and it works out well, right?
I think electric companies certainly take an all hazards approach, and the challenge I think is the timing between sort of a notice event, a hurricane about 120 hours out. You're going to have a general idea where it's going to go, although obviously hurricanes like Milton and Helene or Isaias a couple of years before. Didn't behave the way we expected. So again, you got to have your plan. You got to be flexible. The things that I think are the most challenging are no-notice events. An earthquake, man-made events, where you have to be able to scramble, and that's where the preparation becomes even arguably more important. But I think the approach is the same. And one thing that we, as a trade association, tries to do when we communicate what our companies are doing, and I think it's probably the same in your sector too, is that for certain events you can only go so fast because you have to be safe. and sometimes there are limitations. So it's how do you communicate, we're doing something, but sometimes people have to be patient. And that's one thing where governmental partners can certainly help amplify that, because there are some rules you can bend, but some you can't break.
Yeah, absolutely right. And managing expectations is one of our greatest challenges. Because you got to manage down, you got to manage up, right? But you know, and I wanted to kind of dovetail off of the things that both you gentlemen said. You know, having that coordination at the local level is incredibly important. Where I think we see some of our greatest challenges is some of those isolated communities where the infrastructure may not be as robust. You know, I mean, everybody knows about the wildfires in Palisades. California does a phenomenal job of wildfire response. There's been a lot of loss, and I don't mean to downplay that at all, but there were wildfires in New Mexico that, you know, a few years ago where there were significant challenges because there wasn't as much communications infrastructure. One thing we noticed when DIRS was activated, the Disaster Information Reporting System, was activated for California, there were actually very few communications outages, even though there was mass destruction of infrastructure, because California had the infrastructure in place to be able to fill some of those vital gaps. New Mexico didn't have that benefit, right? So they had individual providers in some very rural areas, and those rural areas provide, yes, service to a very small concentration of the populace, but they're also providing services to tribal nations as well, and they just don't have the funds that are available. So we have to account for things like that, and again, be able to manage expectations. When the reporting comes back to us that there are a few communications outages in New Mexico, we have to think relatively. Right? So you may have 500 cellular sites or cellular towers in California, and you take out 20 of those, and it's not really going to make a huge dent in their ability to communicate. But you may only have 20 cell towers in these rural communities in Mexico, and 20 of them are impacted. That's an entire populace without communications. So taking into consideration the infrastructure in some of these areas, and again, where our communications providers have been so heroic in kind of ensuring that those assets were deployed to provide those temporary services, whether it's Wi-Fi at the emergency operations centers or those emergency evacuation centers, or providing supplemental coverage using satellite communications, those things are incredibly helpful, especially to those smaller communities where they may not have those resources or the personnel to be able to coordinate amongst each other during disasters.
So just following up on that, do you think new policies are needed to improve coordination between all of the stakeholders, or is it voluntary efforts?
You know, that's a good question. I try to stay out of policy because that's a bit of a challenge for us. You know, one thing from an operational perspective that I see is the need to coordinate across the sectors. And we've been kind of harping on this for the last several years. I'm glad energy is here. I'm glad communications are here. We also need similar coordination with our water companies and with the finance companies. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to you can communicate, you know, until you're blue in the face in advance of a storm, but unless you're exercising together, unless you've identified those priorities, that's going to be really important because you need to be able to execute that response and restoration together so that, you know, debris clearance is a big issue. When you deploy power providers to one area to restore, you deploy communications providers to another area to restore, and they're cutting each other's infrastructure while they're trying to clear debris to get to their own facilities. That's a challenge, right? So you want them working together and to be able to prioritize in advance so that as they're moving forward, it's one well-oiled machine. Again, I'd like to see, you know, all the sectors represented inside the state EOCs, inside the regional response coordination centers, so that they can do this in advance, exercising and prioritizing, planning, and implementing together.
So Mike, how do you and other providers work to make sure you're included in that EOC?
Well, our government affairs teams, first of all, engage as soon as things start to unfold. So that connection kind of happens there, but we're active participants in that. We really try to build good relationships with the pole owners. I don't know that we've established what you're talking about, where there's that coordination. Hey, this is what's critical to us. I do think some of that can happen in the EOC, though. Again, you know, we would tell you that we repaired a community in Asheville, and then they'd come in, and the power company would do work, and we'd get cut, and we're back out restoring services for the same community. And then they come in and restore roads, and you know, they damage us again. And you know, so I wish I could say we had better coordination today. I think, you know, we need to work on that. You know, and but you know, again, where we all in the same place, we're all communicating. We do a ride out. Day 2, storm hits, day 2, we ride out our plant. We know where our fiber is down. We know where power is down, and not to send our technicians so that there's safety concerns. We could share all that. We'd be willing to share all that, and we'd love, for information to be shared with us as well. So it's an opportunity we need to tackle.
Do you have any examples of where you've seen this great cross-sector collaboration?
Yeah, I think several. When Ian and Laura hit in Louisiana 4 years ago, I think there was really good coordination between the electric companies with the communication center. They set up joint calls to coordinate. And again, those were really devastating storms. I mean, for Entergy and Clico, the utilities there, I mean, those were like top 5 storms in an area that gets hit a lot. And they were able to get some of that coordination. Even recently during Helene, I was able to put together some of my electric company members with some telecommunications companies through some of the work we've done here in Washington through sort of a organization we call the Cross-Sector Resiliency Forum to help bridge some of those connections. In a perfect world, everybody would know the right person to call. That's always challenging because people change, et cetera. But I think there's a really much stronger understanding of the importance of respecting each other's infrastructure. I mean, I don't want to be too flip here. I mean, we have the advantages. If you touch our stuff, it might kill you. So nobody likes to touch it, and we certainly discourage that. But with fiber, we think that one area where there continues to be some need for work is with debris removal, road clearing. Those are often local authorities, sometimes state authorities, because our tree crews generally understand, don't cut any cables and try to do that as best they can. But, if you've got a pile of debris that's the size of a house in front of the hospital, somebody may say, get out the front loader, chainsaw discipline be damned, get it out of the way. And trying to communicate down at that level is still, I think, an opportunity for improvement. Some credit to the FCC, who's done, during recent storms, really tried to reinforce that to public sector partners, which I think is helpful.
Yeah, thanks. I think if you're not communicating with the public works folks, again, frontline operators, I mean, we're failing in our job. They're amazing.
I was going to ask, what advice do you have for industry providers, electric companies, others, about how to improve the coordination and make these responses quicker and more effective?
Sure. Well, I mean, it starts with leadership, right? So, I mean, you get the heads of these companies to start coordinating with folks like the American Public Works Association, APWA. They've got linkages down to all the state and local levels. And if they don't know someone, they'll find someone for you. But again, that cross-sector coordination is critical in getting the heads of these companies to sit down and actually have these discussions. We have discussions all day with the operators. We have discussions all day with the regulatory affairs folks and legal affairs folks. But who you really need to talk to are those big decision makers, and then you need to ensure that the decision makers are actually talking to their technical people so that they understand what the clear concerns are.
So, Mike, after each one of these natural disasters, and the recovery often takes years, but after you get through the immediate aftermath and at least get temporary networks restored, do you guys sit down and do here's what went well, here's what went bad, here's what we need to work on? Can you talk about that?
Constant calibration. Right. There's always something that could have gone better. And our corporate leadership drives that, actually. And, so we'll do a full postmortem of how we responded. And, we have a playbook. And we're, post-Helene, that playbook changed a lot. Yeah. But I would say post every significant event, what did we do well? A constant state of learning. So yes, that happens consistently.
I'm assuming same with you?
Yeah, very similar. Most electric companies, they really pride themselves on being continuous learning organizations. And particularly in regions that are prone to a lot of natural disasters, they know they have to get better every time because expectations are greater, pressures from stakeholders, and the need to serve the community. So, and even at our level, the trade association, we exercise some of our support processes that we do to facilitate mutual assistance. And one of the things we also do is bring in other sectors, federal partners, local partners, so they can understand how our companies are trying to operate. That's only a piece of the restoration, just getting the workforce lined up and deployed, but it's a critical one. So we find that sharing that is really helpful.
So last week, the FCC published a public notice about disaster preparation and recovery. Can you touch on some of the points?
Sure. Yeah. So, as he just stated, we published a public notice last week. We try and kind of tee off of some of the observations and lessons learned from years past. The focus of this previous public notice had to do with coordination between those sectors, but we also like to push out consumer tips on how best to communicate. In fact, Chris Anderson with Lumen right now is probably giving a great discussion on PACE planning, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. If you don't have alternate means of communicating, you may want to explore some solutions. In fact, there are plenty of great solutions here today that they may be able to help you out for those of you who don't have a PACE plan already in place. But again, kind of situational awareness. And sure, you know where all the resources are located. Having kind of hard copies of things during a disaster is always helpful because you're not always going to have access to the digital piece. But I think I'm kind of preaching to the choir here at this point. I think most of you are more than familiar with communications issues during disasters. But what we try to do is just kind of call out the resources that are available to you, whether it's through the federal government or your state government entities or your communications carriers or those associations. The associations have been critical to those joint exercises to be able to proselytizing some of the information necessary to build kind of that knowledge pool of information relating to those best tips and best practices for disaster response. Also, just kind of pushing, we have 24/7 operations centers, the FCC, FEMA. FEMA has multiple. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has multiple. We all have websites. We've all got consumer tips that are available for everyone. And then if you have comments, because we like to hear your feedback too, positive and negative, believe it or not, I will pick up my phone and take a tail chewing if I need to. Okay, so if you have some feedback for us, things we could do better, I am more than willing to sit down and have a discussion with you over coffee or a beer. That's pretty much it.
Sounds good. Mike, what are some of the best practices from your experience in responding that you use going forward and want to share with everybody?
I think, if you look at the LA wildfires and the command centers they created, the participation that happened there, and just the coordination was really good. And when that works well, right, one, I think it's safer for the people who are performing restoration in the field. You talked about power being on one side of town and us being on the other side, right? And damage happens when we're not coordinated. So efficient use of resources, comes from that. And ultimately, it speeds up recovery, right? Response. So, I think, again, brought up Milton before, and a couple of areas where that happens, it's terrific, right? I mean, it's much more efficient response. So that's a good example.
What about you? What about best practices?
I mean, I think a lot of it's already been touched on in terms of coordination beforehand. And I think, one thing that would be helpful for many electric companies, as I said, is, the identification of both what's critical and then who owns what. And even if that can be shared appropriately, and I understand, right, we all have critical facilities and there's security and other issues, but particularly on the debris removal side, if there's a way to identify so that someone can be contacted maybe before it gets cut. One huge challenge for anybody responding is there's always more work and less people than you really need. But I think trying to build some of that into processes would be helpful. The other big challenge is, there's lots and lots of providers. We've got, we have very large companies, all of whom are smaller than most cable companies, but there are also very small communications providers, very small electric providers, and sometimes those can be gaps. because of a rural area, and keeping those folks in mind to try to how do we all improve together? Because ultimately customers, they don't really care who their service provider is, they want the service.
Yep. So a new twist we may be dealing with this week is a government shutdown. So Justin, can you talk a little bit about how that impacts the FCC's role, your role, and does it have any, I'm assuming doesn't pull you off the field, but can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I can touch on that briefly. I know there's some concern whether or not certain services are going to be available. My team is considered essential workforce, so we'll still be on the clock. When disasters occur, if there's a hurricane while everybody's out, we'll still have personnel to respond. And then we have folks on call to be able to fill some of those vital personnel gaps if necessary. But, for everybody, budgeting is always kind of a concern, right? Thankfully, we've had tremendous support from the chairman's office to get the resources and personnel that we need to ensure that we sustain our operations. And I do want to plug, the need for data, right? So finding new and creative uses for data. For my team specifically during the furlough, we're actually going to be exploring how we can leverage data to be able to fill some of those gaps where we may not have the personnel or expertise necessary to assist. So I think if we're not thinking about prescient uses of data, new uses of data, and how we can apply those to the battlefield or to the disaster, I think we're failing. There are some tremendous technologies like augmented reality, artificial intelligence. If we're not thinking of ways to leverage those technologies for public safety or for national security use, we're not doing our job. So, sorry, a little bit of a tangent.
Oh, that's okay. It's all good. Mike, we have a couple minutes left. Is there anything else you'd like to share or impart on us?
I appreciate being a part of this. I mentioned earlier what South Carolina is doing today, and I don't know what your role is in nudging government agencies, but I think they took the lead, right, in bringing everybody together, not optional, bringing everybody together, and planning.
Yeah.
And ultimately that's what's going to lead to a better response to these events. And again, from our perspective, we're on the clock every day, monitoring everything that's happening, and we'd love nothing more to participate in something like that. So, just more coordination like that would be really helpful.
Definitely. Anything to add?
I think you've hit on a really good point that the state emergency managers, they really understand the consequence business. They typically report to governors. Governors generally have to govern, and we've found that there are big differences in states based on their risk and the threats they have, but, the Carolinas, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, they know they're going to get hit by a hurricane. It's a when, not an if. So they've stepped forward, and we at EEI have engaged with some organizations to try to, how do you spread that information? Because there are risks that people didn't think they were going to have to face, and they are facing it now. Wildfire is a great example. Virtually every single one of our companies is looking at wildfire mitigation plans, including in places that don't, traditionally get a lot of wildfires, because that risk has been elevated, and it's a risk in a lot of different ways. So trying to think outside the box as providers, and how can you get to your other stakeholders to find a collective way, because you're going to have to work as a team when the bad day happens.
Right. Any final words for us?
No, I think you pretty much said it all. Thank
you. Thank you very much for participating. Please join me in thanking them for participating.